I'm not making the argument that it's wonderful and it's far better than the classroom, but I think it's marginally better than the classroom.
John, I always lived in fear in your grad seminars, just so you know.
Yeah, no, well, people have always lived in fear of me because I call on everybody. I always tell them you can run, but you can't hide.
Exactly. All right. Well, on that note, I'll get started with the festivities. Greetings to everybody. I'm Ed Barrett, the research director at the Naval Academy's Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. And on behalf of the center, thank you for attending this discussion about the future of the liberal international order with two renowned scholars, Dr. John Ikenberry of Princeton University and Dr. John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago. The Stockdale Center annually examines a timely ethics topic relevant to military operations through its research seminar and McCain conference. Given mounting doubts about the ability of human rights to guide national and international affairs, last year's topic was the foundations and future of human rights. Unfortunately, COVID forced us to cancel last March's conference, but because concerns about the viability of liberal democracies and the liberal international order have only intensified since last March, we thought it wise to revisit these issues through the newfound magic of Zoom. As mentioned in the invitation, we'll focus on three questions this afternoon. What is the liberal international order? How is it being challenged? And how might it be maintained? Professors Ikenberry and Mearsheimer, thank you for joining us today to provide the definitive answers to these and many other questions. Dr. Ikenberry is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. His most recent book is A World Safe for Democracy, tucked right behind him in his office, Liberal Internationalism and the Crises of Global Order. Dr. Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. His most recent book is The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. Dr. Ikenberry will speak first, followed by Dr. Mearsheimer, each for 20 to 25 minutes, and then followed by your questions sent to me through the chat function. So Professor Ikenberry, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Edward, and good to see John, an old friend, on the screen, and thank you all for coming. It's a great topic that you're posing, and I'll just start by maybe starting with the current moment. I think we've just left a year, 2020, that will long be remembered, destined as a year of crisis, of upheaval, breakdown in the global system, the economic crisis, the public health crisis on a global scale, upheavals we really haven't seen since the 1930s. There's a real feel that many people have that we're at a global turning point, a kind of world historical moment. The world order built after 1945, sometimes called the liberal international order, and we'll talk about that today. Others call it the Western democratic order or the US-led order, seems to be unraveling, maybe ending. So scholars are asking the basic questions again. What are the sources of order? Can liberal democracy rebound? Can there be a cooperative organization of the global system, a kind of collective construction of rules and institutions? And what is the future of liberal internationalism, which is the topic of my new book? But the point is that the most basic questions about order are back on the table. People are going back to their libraries and rereading the classics, Carr, Morgenthau, Polanyi, even a little Mearsheimer, and maybe on a whimsy, a little Ikenberry. So these are the debates that are really in front of us. So in the next 20 minutes, I thought I'd say a little bit about the new President Biden and the vision of liberal order that may be part of this foreign policy agenda, then say something about the deeper challenges of liberal international order, and then end with what does the future look like? What are the steps that might be made to reconstruct a liberal democratic order? And how does it relate to the rising confrontation between the United States and China. I just start by the presidential election because we're really still in that that moment. It was a huge election. I can't imagine that we would be talking about the future of world politics in the same way if the election had gone the other way, if a few 100,000 votes had gone the other way. It was that kind of moment where a passage in one direction rather than the other seemed to have occurred. And we've just been through a extraordinary period of 4 years where I think many people would argue, I certainly would, that the US has gone down a very different, even sort of revisionist path, a dangerous path, attacking the foundations, really, the pillars of this 75-year-old US-led order. Think about it on all the different dimensions, on trade, alliances, public health, environment, arms control, human rights, and what I'll call democratic solidarity, which means a lot in my argument today, democratic solidarity. I think there are implications for a Biden effort to reorient America's role in the world, obviously wanting to reestablish a global position, kind of rebuild its status, its leadership position. I think it clearly wants to signal this with returning to international agreements, the Paris agreements, the WHO, reassuring allies. But what I think what we are seeing is not so much a new foreign policy, but a return to what I would describe as a 75-year grand strategic playbook of tying American power to projects that bring together various states through institutions and partnerships, building frameworks for cooperation, certainly for like-minded states, but more generally platforms for mutual gain that implicate the United States in progress and advancement across a wider sphere of the international system, certainly again among liberal democracies. So a return to diplomacy, multilateralism, security cooperation, the kind of traditional leadership style. And you see this in the various figures. Tony Blinken, he spent his time in the Obama administration trying to build coalitions to fight ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And it's that kind of methodology of building alignments to pursue a strategic ends, I think, is the touchstone of what we will see. But, and here's the big but, it is certainly an effort to bring the United States back that will face great headwinds. And I'm sure we'll talk about this today. Domestic headwinds, of course, it was a very close election. The US is very divided. There's not a consensus, even in foreign policy. And then perhaps more so, a problem internationally, where a global crises of various sorts, not just the pandemic, not just the economic decline, but the broader, you might say, revolt against modernity, the broader upheavals and transformations that are deeply rooted, go way beyond Trump, that are in the international system. So the first set of comments I really want to make are that there are multiple crises unfolding that we have to understand if we're going to answer the question, what is the future of liberal order or the US-led order? And I would say there are three crises that are interactive and mutually unfolding. One is the crisis of geopolitics, if you will, but it's really the global power transition, well-known, widely debated, the US or Western order, which has held sway for decades, indeed centuries, is giving way in one form or another, making room for a rising China, the non-Western world. This is something we've been looking at and thinking about for years now, but it's accelerating in various ways, certainly with China and its more assertive personality today, but it's also more profound, if you will, from what the stories of, say, Paul Kennedy's rise and fall of the great powers, because it's not simply a story inside the Western family of great powers. It's really between two different kinds of states, US and China, with very different values and objectives, each wanting to make the world safe for a different set of institutions and polity principles. So it's a deeper struggle that will be with us for for probably the rest of our lives. The second crisis is what I call the crisis of modernity, the intensification of economic, environmental, and human interdependence. This is, liberals talk a lot about this, perhaps more than realists. The arrival of the Anthropocene era, the three great headless horsemen of the apocalypse, the climate crisis, health pandemics, and weapons of mass destruction proliferating on a global scale. Three great threats to not just interstate relations, but humanity as itself a civilization. And looking for ways to cope with these rising complexities of interdependence would tax any international system, but particularly one that is as degraded as the one that we live in today. We're going to have to reinvent ways to cope with these problems of modernity, and we've only scratched the surface of what that may entail. And thirdly, there's a crisis of liberal democracy, the weakening of the old Western liberal style of liberal democracy, unraveling in various ways, again, deeper than the last president or the most recent cycle of leadership, the erosion of growth coalitions, of class compromises, of pluralist ethics in the body politic, rising inequality, polarization, populism as a kind of manifestation of this. And I would say it's even deeper than that, in the sense that what we often call Enlightenment values, open societies, the rule of law, freedom of speech, the integrity of science, the free flow of information, a civil society as a phenomenon outside the reach of predatory states. All of these features we associate with the last 250 years of global advancement are being discussed in a way that suggests they're more fragile than we thought they were. Certainly at the time of 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and we all thought that history had rendered a verdict. So together, these three crises, I think, are manifesting themselves. We haven't seen a kind of breakdown of cooperation as great as we have today. April 2020 might be a kind of hallmark, when in the midst of this great pandemic, the G7 ministers got together and they couldn't even agree on a communique of common cause, a sense that we really are in a hole here, and it's not clear how we're going to get out. And many of us think that the closest moment that looks like today is the kind of 1930s, 1940s, when at that moment liberal democracy was experiencing a kind of extinction moment. There were major alternative projects for modernity in the communist and fascist worlds that were growing. And so there is a kind of sense that the stakes have grown, and the uncertainty of what will come next is very strong across the board. Now, obviously, there are deep and proximate causes for this crisis. I think I've said a few things about the deep crisis, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I also think in the United States, in the American foreign policy establishment, this has been itself part of the problem, a kind of discrediting of internationalism. And I would mention three more proximate causes of the problem of articulating and defending a notion of a US-led order. One is the Iraq War, which I think discredited internationalists, certainly on the Republican side and to some extent on the Democratic side. The 2008 financial crisis, in some sense, discredited neoliberalism and kind of international elites, internationalist elites on the Democratic side. And then thirdly, the failure of what we might call the liberal bet, that China invited to be a responsible stakeholder in this order, join the WTO, would move in a direction closer rather than further away from a liberal democratic system. And in some sense, all three of these failures and disappointments have really led to a question: is this the end? Is this a verdict that we need to now think about a different American post-liberal international order, or or do we defend the accomplishments while acknowledging the failures? And it's that latter choice that I would take up today, and I do in my book, to recall and defend order features that we want to preserve, even as we have to struggle in this more agonistic world to do so. And this is where I'll just make the argument that after 1945, the US and its partners built a far-flung, complex system of relations, unlike anything that had been seen before. That's why we have a hard time finding a label for it. It's not empire, it's not balance of power. It was a global complex with regional systems built around institutions, alliances, partnerships, shared values, strategic interests, built around a set of convictions that often are seen as the core convictions of the liberal international imagination. First, that openness, trade openness, if you will, exchange, has possibilities for mutual gain properly managed. Secondly, that institutions facilitate cooperation in various ways. Thirdly, that liberal democracies have some special capacity to work with each other, have values that might lead them to want to affiliate with each other, to build a kind of critical mass among themselves for creating a space that allows for them to function at a higher level. And then finally, rising interdependence, which is associated with modernity, with the great forces of science, technology, industrialism, mean that we are in each other's face more than ever before. We are connected in ways we can't disconnect, really. And under conditions of rising interdependence, we have reasons to look for ways to coordinate and cooperate rather than the alternative. And I'll come back to that. But under the auspices of this system, the U.S. built, and we often forget this in the wake of our debates about the failures of the last few decades, that there was a kind of world system created for states to seek mutual advantage under the auspices of this order. And this is my most important point today, really, is that there was a lot of work done in this order. Democracies were able to reopen the world economy. That's number one. Secondly, there was a reintegration of Germany and Japan, a kind of framework for them to come together. All the advanced industrial countries found a way to make a passage from a kind of 19th century liberal democracy to what we now call modern welfare states. This was done under the auspices of this post-war system. Germany and France found a new way to bind themselves together. Think of the coal and steel community launching the European Union. The trilateral countries more generally created mechanisms, permanent mechanisms to facilitate governments from doing things better. Think of the Bretton Woods system, giving governments tools to make good on their rising promises to their own people. Number six, this framework, this US-led order, created a kind of home for countries that were making transitions from other forms of government, a place to affiliate, to seek security, assistance, trade, and institutional cooperation. And in some ways, this was an order, we sometimes call it the Pax Americana, in which China had its best decades in 2 millennia, found a way to trade and advantage itself that we'll talk about later. But arguably, and this is my bottom line, if you were to look at the last 75 years from an American perspective, and I think from a wider perspective of the liberal democratic world, this was the most successful international order in world history, defined in terms of 3 metrics: wealth creation, the absence of physical violence, and a glimmering of social justice. So what went wrong? And these are my last remarks. In some ways, what happened was these countries were a victim of their own success. The order had its highest functioning decades inside of the Cold War. And this is where John and I might disagree, but this is really when this order crystallized, if you will. And it was, in some sense, a kind of club, a kind of subset of a larger international system where free world states could create a kind of mutual aid society. And to be in this order was to buy into a kind of suite of responsibilities, of rights and obligations. There was a kind of logic of conditionality. You see this logic of conditionality in the EU, but it was also part of the liberal order. And it was an important component, and I make this argument in my book, because the old liberal vision of Wilson in the 19th century was of a kind of moral rectitude enforced by world public opinion. Well, that was ridiculous. It didn't work. And this next generation of architects of order realized that. And in some sense, they said to enforce good behavior, you have to, in some sense, create a club that is exclusive, that not everybody can get in. That to get in is to incentivize you to play by the rules and to advance your activities to promote this higher set of social purposes outside of a mere kind of anarchic order. But what happened was this inside order became the outside order, that the club lost its club characteristics. It became more, and I argue this in the book, more like a shopping mall where states could wander in and wander out. I've also used the term public utility. You could connect your pipes to the system, this one, but not this one, different providers, a kind of fragmentation of the coherence of the complex. You could pick and choose. And of course, this is, again, takes us back to China. So where do we go from here? And I would just simply say, there are, there's no, I don't think there's any safe passage. I don't think there's any obvious and inevitable next era. I do think states, liberal democracies will want to try to reimagine and recreate this order. After all, this order was in some sense built because they wanted to make themselves safe, to make the world safe for democracy. Democracies, all states are, but democracies in their own special way, very vulnerable types of polities. We know this it goes all the way back to Aristotle and Polybius, and then on to Machiavelli and Montesquieu and Alexander Hamilton. The kind of Republican political institutions are vulnerable to geopolitics. You need to have a kind of space, a zone of protection where your fragile institutions are not subject to garrison state incentives. And so you need to, in some sense, create, like you do for eggs, a kind of container. And the liberal order in many ways is an egg carton. And to engage in liberal order building is to build egg cartons for liberal democracies to make themselves safe. So how do you redo this? How do you do this for the next era? And I'll just mention three things. I think you need to, in some sense, retie liberal international order to the everyday lives of everyday people. There is a kind of sense that the liberal order became a neoliberal project for bankers and corporations to do deals, and a loss of how people on Main Street might be tied to a larger system of cooperation that creates resources for their governments to do things that they expect them to do. So in some sense, a kind of reconnecting of international order to domestic order. Every high moment in the past 200 years of internationalism has been tied to domestic social movements. The 19th century reform liberalism, the progressive era, the New Deal era, and so forth. Secondly, I do think that the liberal vision needs to return to basics, which is not that the liberal project, the liberal international project, is to promote globalization, a kind of Thomas Friedman, the world is flat, because it certainly is not flat, but to remind people that liberal internationalism is fundamentally about managing interdependence, not about expanding interdependence necessarily or promoting globalization, but finding pragmatic, opportunistic, world-weary solutions to problems of interdependence. Those problems are not going to go away. And if I'm right, they're going to get worse. And so we will need more, not less, liberal international organization. And so those are the main things. And then finally, just a few words, because I got, I think, 2 minutes left. China. In some ways, if there's good news for liberal order, there's probably bad news for US-China relations. There's a kind of inverse relationship. Part of why we might wish a liberal international reconstruction well is that there's power in numbers, that a world that has a kind of center of gravity tied to liberal democracies is one that will be less threatened by illiberal states that wish them ill. This is what FDR believed more than anything else when he and his advisors talked about the grand area, and the fundamental motivation of American policy coming out of World War II was to create a kind of new order among the liberal democracies so they would be the critical mass, with the idea that if they were increasingly marginalized in a larger Westphalian anarchic order, where the illiberal fascist or totalitarian states hold sway, their prospects are reduced. So there is power in numbers, rebuilding that coalition. It was seen as an explicit part of what was done in the 40s. It's in a 21st century way, this would need to be done, not least because China, more so than I certainly appreciated 15 or 20 years ago, before China began its great ascent, China is clearly oriented towards a different kind of modernity, one that will be one that the United States and other Western liberal democracies and other non-Western liberal democracies will want to avoid. So perhaps there's an incentive that we didn't have 20 years ago to compose our differences and to look for ways for the liberal democracies to build a kind of new gathering, a kind of D10 or D15 that can provide a kind of coalition in the absence of American hegemony, which will never be as strong as it used to be, a kind of coalition of states who can drive the reform agenda and can protect values that we would like to see survive the 21st century for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And we aren't going to be able to do that alone, operating in a fragmented world. As Benjamin Franklin said on the eve of the American Constitution to the 13 colonies, we will need to hang together, because if we don't, we will certainly hang separately. Thank you.
All right, thank you, John. Just a reminder to everybody listening, go ahead and put any questions you have at this point in chat, and I'll get to them right after Dr. Mearsheimer's talk. And John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and John Ikenberry, both University of Chicago PhDs. And I only wish that I was physically present at the Naval Academy instead of doing this virtually, but maybe another day. I think that in answering your questions, I will give a talk that could be placed under the rubric of the rise and fall of the liberal international order. And it's important to understand, and I think for most of the midshipmen watching this exchange, this will be hard to comprehend. But in the early 1990s, when the Cold War ended, there was a huge amount of optimism in the United States about America's position in the world, about American foreign policy, and about the liberal international order. In fact, that optimism, I would argue, is reflected in John Ikenberry's classic book, After Victory. If you look at After Victory, which I would encourage you to do, John basically makes the argument that we have found the magic formula for making the liberal international order work for as far as the eye can see. And moreover, it's going to be a really happy time ahead. We're in the era of peace, love, and dope. Realism is effectively dead, right? The liberal international order is here to stay. As you all know, something went badly wrong along the way. Not in the 1990s, but it began to happen in the early 2000s. And 2016 was really the critical year. Two things happened in 2016 that indicated that the liberal international order was in serious trouble. One was Brexit. And then number two was the election of Donald Trump. I'm not going to talk much about this now, but it's very important to understand that Donald Trump ran against the liberal international order. He hated the liberal international order. He was elected in 2016, and absent COVID, he would have been reelected in 2020. And indeed, even with COVID, if he had acted like an adult over the past year, he would have gotten reelected. And again, he ran against the liberal international order. And then there's Brexit. And my basic argument is the liberal international order is history. It's over, folks. And my argument, as I'll make clear as I go along here, is that it was doomed from the get-go because it contained the seeds of its own destruction. Now, let me start off by defining what exactly the liberal international order is, because John and I have some differences here that are reasonably important. Then let me talk a little bit about the history of the liberal international order, and then go to the meat and potatoes of my talk, which is why it failed, why all that optimism has now turned into abject pessimism, and then say just a few words about where we're headed. Let me define the liberal international order by first defining what an order is. It's very important that you understand exactly what an order is. An order is basically an organized group of international institutions that helps govern relations among the members and helps those members deal with other countries that are not in the order itself. So an order is a compilation of institutions. If you think of the Cold War order in the West, right? We had NATO, we had the IMF, we had the World Bank. These were all institutions. And these institutions were cobbled together to form an order. And you also want to remember that institutions are basically rules. There's widespread agreement on that point in the literature. So orders are a conglomeration of rules. And the reason that orders are so important, the reason that rules are so important, is because in an incredibly complicated and interdependent world like the one we live in, you just need rules for states to deal with each other. If NATO is an institution and NATO is all about rules, what's going on there is that you need NATO so you have clear rules on how the members of NATO interact with each other, especially if they have to fight a war against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We are consigned to having an order of one sort or another for as far as the eye can see. Because again, we live in a highly interdependent and complicated world where we need rules. So institutions are rules, and orders are basically an organized group of institutions. Now, what about an international order? And here's where John and I have some disagreement. For me, an international order has to include all the great powers in the system to be international. Otherwise, it's a bounded order. So to get ahead of myself, when I talk about the Cold War order, the Cold War order in the West was not an international order because it didn't include the Soviet Union or the Soviet allies or China for most of the Cold War. It was a bounded order. And my argument is that after 1990, when we were in the unipolar moment and there was only one great power, which was the United States, obviously, we had an international order. So I distinguish between bounded orders, which don't include all the great powers, and international orders, which include all the great powers. Then very importantly, we get to the word liberal. What is a liberal international order? I've told you what an order is, right? I've told you what an international order is versus a bounded order. Now let me tell you what I think a liberal international order is. The leading state has to be a liberal democracy. And indeed, you need a number of important players in that order to be liberal democracies, right? To have a liberal international order. Furthermore, you want to pay a lot of attention to the question of what are the goals of the liberal international order. There are basically three goals. One is obviously to spread liberal democracy all over the planet. If you want to have a liberal international order that includes every state on the planet, in an ideal world, every state would be a liberal democracy. Number two, you want to promote an open international economy, and you want to integrate every state into that open international economy. In a very important way, what you want to do is you want to get them hooked on capitalism. You want to create a lot of economic interdependence. And then thirdly, you want to rely heavily on institutions, and you want to integrate states, especially all the great powers in the system, into those institutions so that they become responsible stakeholders. They obey the rules. Remember, institutions are rules, right? And this is what we wanted to do with China and with Russia after 1990. We wanted to integrate them into those international institutions that existed so they became responsible stakeholders. Now, the final point I want to make, which has been implicit in what I've said up to now, in my opinion, you need unipolarity to have a liberal international order. If you have more than one great power in the system, i.e. if you have bipolarity or multipolarity, those great powers are going to compete with each other for security. You're going to get balance of power politics, realpolitik, and you can't have a liberal international order. You need unipolarity. Okay, now let me go to the second part of my talk, which is briefly talk about the history. And here I think you'll see that John and I just have a slightly different view of the history. John believes that the liberal international order was created in 1945 and existed up to at least 2017. Maybe he believes it still exists today. I believe that the liberal international order was created in roughly 1990. And what you had between 1945 and 1989 was a world that was dominated by two bounded orders that were realist to the core. One was an order that was dominated by the Soviet Union. It included institutions like the Warsaw Pact and Comecon on one side. And on the other side, you had a Western order, an order that was led by the United States that included institutions like NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, so forth and so on, that was mainly concerned with waging a security competition with the Soviet Union. So I believe that you did not have a meaningful, a thick international order during the Cold War. What you had were two bounded orders that were not international and were not liberal. Then what happens is that the Cold War ends and the Soviet-led order goes down the toilet bowl. It just disappears. It's gone. In fact, the Soviet Union is gone by December 1991. And we won. This is why we were so optimistic. And what we do then in the early 1990s is we take that Western-led bounded order and we expand it into, or we attempt to expand it into a liberal international order. And my point to you is we can do that. The United States could do that because it's the unipole. It doesn't have to worry about great power competition. By definition, there's only one great power in the system. So great power competition, realpolitik, is taken off the table for the United States, and it's free to pursue an ideological agenda, also known as a liberal agenda, And it's in a position to take that Western bounded order and turn it into a liberal international order. And if you look at things like NATO expansion, EU expansion, the promotion of the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, this is all part and parcel of our effort to take that Western order and make it into an international order. And not a realist order, but a liberal order. Because we don't need to worry about realism. We're the only great power on the planet. And what happens is that this enterprise is actually quite successful in the 1990s. John's book comes out, his classic book, After Victory, comes out in 2001. And John looks kind of like a genius. People are thinking that, he's really nailed this one. But as I said to you before, by 2016, the liberal international order is in real trouble. Now, what you want to ask yourself is what went wrong? And as John Mearsheimer said to you at the start of his talk, this whole enterprise contained the seeds of its own destruction. Now, what exactly do I mean? Let me point out 4 ways in which this enterprise was doomed from the start. First of all, it ended up turning China into a great power. The idea was, John talked about the liberal bet. The idea was that we were going to help China grow economically, make it prosperous, get it hooked on capitalism, make it really rich, and turn it into a responsible stakeholder. We were going to integrate it into institutions like the WTO. From a realist point of view, this was insanity. You will realize, all you midshipmen who are going to spend the rest of your life worrying about the China threat, that the foreign policy elites in the United States created this threat. Or let's put it differently, they helped create this threat. They created on purpose a really powerful China because they were betting that it would be a responsible stakeholder. Can you believe that? And their bet failed. And now we're facing Godzilla. No realist in his right mind would have ever done such a foolish thing. But anyway, the point is, we helped China grow. And the end result is we no longer live in a unipolar world. In fact, Vladimir Putin, who comes online in the early 2000s, basically resurrects the Russians from the dead. So now we're in a multipolar world. It's not only the Chinese, it's the Russians as well. My point to you early on, and you cannot underestimate the importance of this point, you cannot have a liberal international order in a multipolar world. You just can't do that. You need unipolarity. And furthermore, do you really think that China is a liberal state that's going to be happy with a liberal international order? I would not bet a lot of money on that, I'll tell you that. They have no interest in a liberal international order, right? So what we did with China doomed the liberal international order. That's point one. Secondly, we were heavily into the business of spreading democracy across the planet. And this got us, and it got the liberal international order into real trouble. First of all, we ended up fighting all these unnecessary and losing wars. And the amount of murder and mayhem that we're responsible for creating in the greater Middle East is truly stunning, right? And we get into wars in places like Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We're going to lose. We got into a war in Iraq. We lost. We made a colossal mess of Libya. We've helped make a colossal mess of Syria. We were really great at spreading liberal democracy in the Middle East. And of course, that's what the Bush Doctrine was all about. So we ended up fighting all these unnecessary wars that we lost. And that did a lot, as John pointed out, to discredit the liberal international order. Furthermore, we couldn't fight wars against China and Russia, but we tried to spread democracies into those two countries as well. And you know what? They didn't like it at all. You all know that the United States does not like the idea of the Russians interfering in our elections. The idea of the Russians interfering in American politics is anathema to us. Well, don't you think that the Soviets and the Chinese feel that the United States interfering in their domestic politics and trying to spread democracy and promote human rights in Russia and China is a violation of their sovereignty? That's exactly what they think. So this liberal international order not only led to these unnecessary wars in the greater Middle East, it also helped poison relations with Russia and China and gave them all sorts of incentives to undermine the liberal international order. Third, globalization. Globalization did a terrific job at wealth creation. There's no doubt about it. And it did a lot to help countries all around the world, especially China. That was my point before. And globalization made the American elite rich. John and I and Ed, we're all much richer as a result of globalization and what the liberal international order did. But there are huge numbers of Americans in the lower classes and even in the middle class who did not benefit from globalization, who did not benefit from the liberal international order. And many of these people are Trump voters. They are really angry. They're angry about the tremendous inequality, economic inequality in America, and they're angry about the fact they lost their jobs and can't find better jobs or new jobs. Right? So globalization, it might have helped China become a peer competitor, but and it might have helped people who are well off to begin with, like us, become wealthier. But for your average American, it did not do one whole heck of a lot. Then finally, there's the question of open borders. You want to understand that the liberal international order promotes open borders. The famous Schengen Agreement in Europe is a manifestation of this. The way liberals talk about the border with Mexico today, right? The liberal worldview trends to treat everybody as part of an international community and doesn't privilege the importance of borders and is open to all sorts of illegal immigration and so forth and so on. This is bound to cause trouble in a world where nationalism is a really powerful force. You see this reflected in the Brexit vote. And again, you see this reflected in support for Donald Trump. You cannot have open borders or anything approximating open borders in a world where the most powerful political ideology on the planet is nationalism. So all of these different factors came together. Globalization, the spreading of democracy, open borders, and the rise of China to doom the liberal international order. Now, the question is, where are we headed? My basic view as to where we are headed is that we're going to end up in a situation that is somewhat analogous to what we had during the Cold War. You're going to have an American-dominated order on one side, and you're going to have a Chinese-dominated order on the other side. And those two orders are going to be principally concerned with waging competition with each other. This is not to say you won't have a lot of cooperation inside each of those bounded orders. And note the word I'm using here, folks. It's a bounded order, a Chinese-led bounded order and an American-led bounded order. You'll have cooperation inside those orders, just as you had cooperation during the Cold War inside the American-led Western order and the Soviet-led Eastern order. But in terms of how those orders interact with each other, that's where the security competition will take place, as was the case during the Cold War. On top of that, you will have a thin international order. It won't be a liberal international order. That thin international order will include China and the United States and Russia, just as we had a thin international order during the Cold War that included the United States and the Soviet Union. But once you're in a world where you have two bounded orders that are engaged in security competition with each other, you're basically saying, in effect, that the liberal international order is no more. May it rest in peace. Thank you.
All right, thank you, John. I'm just going to add a couple of spotlights. A lot of really good questions, including from the students. Professor Ikenberry, did you want to respond to
If you
a
want
couple
me
of
to,
John's
I
comments?
can. I certainly will if you want me to.
And
You
we,
just,
we should go to questions. I mean, I'd love to hear John, but given that we have limited time and the midshipmen are here, we ought to let them ask questions. And John and I can respond to each other in part in answering the questions.
that sounds good. Yeah, that was what I was thinking would be best. So here's a good question, really to John Ikenberry. In the interest of furthering the goal of retying the liberal international order to everyday people, what are some tangible, practical steps that American policymakers can take to achieve this outcome?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and I think we're kind of into domestic politics at some point about how one can galvanize our resources to rebuild a middle class and connect people's lives to the larger system. I think I would start with trade policy, trying to get a new understanding among other industrial societies about trade that would be tempered with a kind of rebuilding of the social safety net and the kind of programs that we associate with the modern social democratic state. The term we often use is embedded liberalism, that when the liberal order, which I do think, and I'm glad to defend this, liberal order, leave aside international, the Western liberal order actually even predates World War II. It was in its kind of high era during the Cold War. It was a bounded order. So maybe I should go ahead and get this out of the way. But as you notice, my argument is that liberal order, in some sense, for it to function, needs to be bounded. It can't be a global liberal order would only make sense if all the major states of the system were liberal democracies. And short of that, it will always be a partial bounded order where there are gatekeepers and exclusions, and there are sort of entry barriers that I talked about earlier. And part of what that system, that more club-oriented character to Western liberal order did, was it allowed these governments after World War II to create mechanisms through the Bretton Woods system and the trade system to reconcile, if you will, openness with economic stability. This is the Keynesian revolution, developing and putting in the hands of governments capacities to promote full employment and to have openness to the extent it promoted efficiencies and comparative advantage and growth, which is still out there as a logic that we want to keep in the system, but tempering it with if not protectionism, with managed openness that allows governments to overturn commitments to simple openness, as you saw in the 19th century, for in the name of protecting jobs or providing assistance as certain jobs give way and others emerge. So this kind of activist role of connecting trade and economic development to a full service modern government dedicated to making sure that technology and monetary policy and industrial policy all serve the interests of the middle class. Because I agree with John, the Western societies, starting with the United States, really have taken a hit, and that will never, we will never be able to recreate a functioning international order that I would call liberal oriented, a Western liberal order, until we connect that internationalism to these sorts of domestic programs.
Okay. John, did you want to respond to that?
No, I think it's better that the students get to ask.
Okay. So here's a good question from one of my students, Zach Vandel, which is how would a future politician restart the anti-liberal international order position for the United States without being immediately delegitimized by our country's elites, much like Donald Trump was from 2016 to now?
You want me to say a few words about that?
Sure.
I think that Donald Trump was a very special case. Donald Trump was somebody who was, for better or for worse, a polarizing figure. And I think that he's now behind us. And I think with what you're going to see with the Biden administration is what really matters. And with regard to the Biden administration, I believe the Biden administration will talk like the liberal international order is still alive and well. But what they will actually do is move forward, much the way Donald Trump moved forward, to help create a bounded American-led order to deal with the Chinese bounded order that is now emerging. What I'm saying to you, and I'm saying in response to Zach's question, is I think that although there will be a great emphasis on difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden at the rhetorical level, in fact, Trump has set the train in motion, right, to move away from the liberal international order and to create a bounded order that may have many liberal features and therefore make John happy, but nevertheless, it will be a bounded order. So I don't think there will be that much difference in practice between what President Biden does and what President Trump formerly did. Although I think rhetorically, there will be a huge difference.
Right, right. Okay, here's another question. And basically it involves your assessment of the ramifications of each of your arguments for the future of the military. So if your arguments are true, what should the military look like in the next 20 years? Military budget, force structure, force posture.
Well, John has probably a lot to say about that. Let me just say a few words. Again, I think to kind of have a conversation here, we need to kind of keep our terms sort of defined. And for me, the term liberal international order, actually, I will have to say this, the first use of that term was in an article I wrote with Dan Dudney in 1999. Before that, the term was never used, and it's not found in the literature. And it wasn't until about 5 years later that the New York Times used it for the first time. So I do think I kind of know what the term means. And there are two aspects of it. One is an international order, not necessarily global, but an international, interstate order that has liberal characteristics: multilateralism, rule of law, transparency, reciprocity, trade. These are kind of an international order that has liberal characteristics. But liberal international order, as I refer to it, and I think as most people do, also means an international order organized around liberal democracies with features in that order that are not necessarily liberal or don't have liberal properties, like the alliance system. So for me, the alliance system was very important for creating architecture for cooperation among the liberal democracies so that they could collectively create a space, an egg carton for those liberal democracies to operate. Again, it wasn't a global project. It was a project among liberal democracies to make themselves safe. And so the part of making themselves safe was making themselves safe. That is to say, secure. And that entailed really valorizing security cooperation embedded in NATO and the alliances in East Asia. These are hallmarks really of the American-led order that have, as a liberal, I see their realist virtues that John can talk about, but also their virtues as mechanisms that help bind together the liberal democracies. Germany and France, keeping Germany down, the Americans in and the Russians out. That NATO logic was very much an architectural set of principles that allowed for these countries to operate collectively over many, many decades. So my bottom line here, to answer the question, is that in some sense, while I don't have a view about budget levels and technologies, for me, a world in 2040 will be a more friendly world to, again, the values and institutions that I hold dear, and I think both of you do as well, is to have have the United States tied to, in various forms of cooperation, including security cooperation with its allies in Europe and Asia. And it becomes all the more important as China rises, and until it emerges into a new shape and perhaps moves in our direction, it is going to be a security rival, and the alliances are going to matter in that competition.
I think with regard to the future of the US military, we are going to have our hands full trying to contain China. This is a country that now has 4 times as many people as the United States. If it had a per capita GNP that looked like South Korea, it would be twice as wealthy as the United States. Just think about that. At the height of the Cold War, right, the Soviet Union had roughly the same size population as the United States, and at most, it had 1/3 the wealth of the United States. And here we're talking about a country, right, that in the year 2050 is supposed to have 3.7 times as many people as us, 3.7 times as many people, and will probably be about 2 times, maybe even more wealthy than the United States. And we're taking them on 6,000 miles from the California coast. We are going to have our hands full. And this is going to be the principal military mission of the United States moving forward. And again, you want to remember that the liberal international order and liberal hegemony, which is the American foreign policy that we've pursued since the Cold War ended, right? And it was pursued by both Democrats and Republicans alike, helped create this behemoth that we now have to deal with, and you're going to have to deal with. Now, let me say a little bit about force structure. Look, during the Cold War, the Soviet threat was centered on Europe. It was the Central Front. And the forces that mattered the most for dealing with the Soviet threat were ground forces, i.e. the Army, and air forces. The Navy did not matter much. It mattered, but it did not matter much during the Cold War. We're in a fundamentally different world now, as you surely know. If you look at the geography of Asia, it's quite clear that the Army doesn't matter very much, and that the Air Force and the Navy matter one whole heck of a lot. So I think all of you are going to have a lot to think about vis-a-vis the China threat. It's going to be the main concern you're going to face when thinking about grand strategy, operational strategy, and tactics moving forward. And I am sad to say, but I think one whole heck of a lot of money is going to be spent on the Navy and the Air Force. And I think that there is a real possibility that we will get into a shooting war at some point with China. I hope that doesn't happen, but I think it is possible. And it makes me very nervous. And again, I just can't believe that we helped create this behemoth.
Can I just ask John, it's a kind of counterfactual in the 1990s. First of all, China was already in the international order. It wasn't simply on the outside wanting to get in. It was a permanent member of the UN Security Council, in most major international institutions. We did make bets that turned out, as I said, to be wrong. But the counterfactual always puzzles me. The idea of a American grand strategy in the 21st century tied to a multi-generational effort to keep 1.2 billion people poor and unhappy. How do you do that? In what sense could we have had a different policy that would have been sustainable in an American democracy with values and institutions and traditions and a history of what we know about the world we live in? How would we have contained or put the thumb on such a large, proud country in a way that would have made our lives today better off? I would see a very angry China with nuclear weapons and all the instruments of power, but poor, unhappy, outside of some kind of system that the U.S. was enforcing on China. What kind of world would that have been? I don't know anybody who credibly argued that, including realists at the time, who, by the way, were more worried about Germany and Japan as rivals to the United States at the very end of the Cold War. So, what is the 40-year grand strategy that could keep China poor, unhappy, and outside of our world?
Let me make a couple points. First of all, there's no way we could have done it simply because public opinion in the United States was firmly opposed to doing it, because public opinion was firmly on your side and elite opinion was on your side. When you said before that we made a bet that China could rise peacefully, that bet was supported by almost everybody in the national security or foreign policy establishment, you included. So I don't think it was feasible given where the American foreign policy elite was at the time. I want to be very clear. If you read my Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which came out in 2001, I said that the United States should go to great lengths to try to slow down, if not reverse, Chinese growth. So there was at least one person on the planet who was making that argument. But I was a lone voice in the wilderness because you and your buddies dominated the discourse. The problem is that you bet wrong, and we now are facing Godzilla. Now, your question is, could we have done anything to slow down China? Yes, we could have done a lot of things to slow down China. One is not let them in the WTO. This was a huge mistake. And all sorts of liberal elites, you included, supported bringing China into the WTO because you thought it was going to become a responsible stakeholder. Well, you were wrong. And bringing them into the WTO made them much more powerful and, in my opinion, much more dangerous. Now, would it ultimately have worked, even if we could have slowed them down in the short term by denying the membership in the WTO and doing other things? Would it have worked in the long term? I don't know. It might not have worked. That's the thrust of your argument. You might be right. I can't tell. But I find it amazing that we didn't at least think about trying to slow down China's growth and then trying to do what we could to stop it. If you look at Britain before World War I, the British saw Germany rising, and they thought long and hard about how to stop Germany's rise. They ultimately decided they couldn't stop it, but they at least thought about it. We didn't even think about it, except for a handful of people like me. Everybody else.
Well, I would just say that this is an important debate, and I hope that our midshipmen know that we are going to be thinking about this for a long time. I would just want to keep one thing in mind, and that is that we didn't have in looking at the post-Cold War approach to China, there never was a singular grand strategic statement. There was a consensus that kind of emerged, both Republicans and Democrats, about China and how to think about China, and it really had two components. One is what we've been talking about. At the time, it was called engagement, that we would be interacting with them and trying to elicit behaviors they were still, this is Deng Xiaoping, there was a real sense of openness. There was not a sense that they would become a liberal democracy, but the term that was used most often, I think in the Clinton administration there would be kind of economic freedom that would be planted or encouraged inside of China, and that would be better than the alternative, and it might lead to more pluralism and contestation and move in our direction. But that was one feature, engagement of China. The other feature of American implicit multi-administration grand strategy towards China was securing the balance of power, that we would not just maintain, but we would strengthen our alliances when the Cold War was over. And there was a real question, should we even keep these alliances? There was a real effort to define them and re-legitimate them as stabilizing forces to discourage a rising China to use its power for military purposes. So there's always been a kind of, as there was during the Cold War, a kind of a double strategy. Part of it is traced to kind of realist insights. Part of it might be traced to liberal insights, engagement, but balance and counterbalance, and at shoring up and make sure that it's not just America versus China, but it's the allies, Japan most importantly, but also South Korea and all the other bilateral alliance ties that connect the United States to East Asia and increasingly to India. So I've always thought it wasn't simply a kind of naive bet that we'll let them trade with us and capitalism will kind of the lapping tides of capitalism will erode authoritarian structures. That was clearly something that some of us hoped for, but there was always this much more realist insight about maintaining a balance. And I think that's always been there as a kind of double strategy along with engagement.
Ed, can I have 1 minute on this?
Sure.
John, this was a naive bet, right? You say that we were interested, that we had a vested interest in maintaining the balance of power in Asia. And of course, that's true because we were by far the dominant power in Asia, and we wanted to keep it that way. But if you pursue a policy that helps China grow its economy and turns it into an economic superpower, you are going to upset the balance of power by definition. How could it be otherwise? Did you seriously think that when you turn this country into an economic superpower, that it wouldn't translate that economic might into military might? The United States, as you surely have noticed, is a liberal democracy, and it's very rich, and it builds incredibly powerful military forces. Why wouldn't China, as it became a liberal democracy and a rich liberal democracy at that, build powerful military forces, which of course it's done. And the end result is it's upset the balance of power. And we're now at a point where it may be the case that over time, China is by far the most powerful country in Asia, not the United States. This is not in our interest. And we inadvertently caused this situation. And it was because people like you, and not only you by any means, I'm saying you're just reflective of the foreign policy establishment in general, had this idea that by growing China economically, integrating it into institutions and so forth and so on, it would turn into a responsible stakeholder. It was, in your terminology, a bet, and we lost. And I'd say the consequences are really disturbing.
But the theory is that even though they would become more powerful, as the middle class grew, they would liberalize politically. That hasn't happened. That was, I think, seen as kind of an iron law of social science until now. So is it the case that law was wrong, or that they're going to liberalize? It's just going to take a little bit longer.
Well, my point is, even if they had liberalized, they still would have built military forces. The United States is a liberal democracy. This idea that once they liberalize and become a responsible stakeholder, that they don't build military forces is at odds with what the United States did over the course of its history as a liberal democracy.
I I don't disagree with John, and I mean the outcome is one that I see, and I think it is we are in for a very tough future of competition, and that's why I wish the liberal international order, or we'll call it the Western liberal order, so I don't violate John's definition of international, but we should wish the alliance of democracies well, because that will be an important bulwark against a more powerful and illiberal China, which, by the way, again, I just don't see how John's grand strategy. I think John fancies himself as a realist, and he likes to point out people who have illusions in their arguments. But it almost seems like it's the grandest of illusions to think that you can keep China poor, hungry, unhappy, weak for the 21st century. 1.2 billion people in a civilizational state that 500 years ago was larger in its size, partly because of its population, than the Western countries. So it seems like it's the grandest of delusions, really, to think that a grand strategy of containment, and it's not just containment, it's undercutting and diminishing China to the point where they would not be a 21st century rival. That just seems like it's a fantasy. And so how do you, in the real world, marshal engagement and balancing tools to make the best of it? So I guess that's where I come out on this very interesting debate.
Well, one more quick question before the midshipmen have to run to their classes, and it's from midshipman Kathleen Rock. And she has watched The Case for Restraint, John's lecture series online. And her question is, just briefly, and this is the question for both of you, can you expound upon which situations would be considered geopolitically significant, and what actions would warrant counterbalancing by the United States?
Yeah, I have a simple answer to that. I believe that there are three areas of the world that are worth fighting and dying for. One is Europe, two is East Asia, and three is the Persian Gulf. And I believe that you only fight and die in those areas when there is a potential hegemon. There's no potential hegemon in Europe. I would have left Europe, put an end to NATO at the end of the Cold War. And there's no potential hegemon in the Persian Gulf either. Therefore, I'd move to an over-the-horizon capability similar to the one you had during the Cold War, or the latter part of the Cold War, with the Rapid Deployment Force. The area where there's a potential hegemon is in East Asia, and that, of course, is China. And there's no doubt that China's neighbors cannot balance by themselves against a rising China, so that the United States has to be there. And we're going to have to be there in a serious way. As I said before, I think both President Trump and President Biden understand that basic fact of life, and we will be there. When I think of restraint, I think it largely in terms of ending the forever wars that Democrats and Republicans started mainly after 2001. I think about ending the war in Afghanistan, ending the war in Iraq, basically getting out of the Middle East, getting out of these small wars, and exercising restraint in the greater Middle East. But with regard to China, unlike a number of my friends who profess the importance of restraint, I don't think we should show restraint vis-a-vis China. I think we should go full bore to try to contain China. I'm not calling for a highly militaristic and aggressive foreign policy where we provoke a war with them, but I do think we want to have a robust containment policy, because Asia, East Asia in particular, matters strategically to the United States, and there's a serious threat there, obviously. There's a potential peer competitor in China, so we should focus there. So there won't be a lot of restraint in my story vis-a-vis China, but I'd like to see us return to restraint when it comes to the forever wars.
Yeah. Dr. Ikenberry, last comment on that?
I definitely am against forever wars, and I think that's not a realist perspective. I think liberals are equally on board on that. I have to, on the Iraq War issue, the architects of the war were not liberals. They were of a certain kind of hegemonic realist. It was Cheney and Rumsfeld, and the liberal patina of justification came later after no weapons of mass destruction were found. The war was precisely what John just hinted at when he said, the Americans should fight and die if America's hegemonic position is threatened by a regional hegemon. That was the argument that Cheney made for a Iraq that would, with its leader Saddam Hussein, would challenge the United States if he had weapons of mass destruction. So it was a counter regional hegemonic threat that was the kernel of the Iraq War impetus, and the democracy promotion, bringing Jefferson to Baghdad. That was not done by liberal internationalists. It was done by others who wanted to wrap their efforts in the flag of liberal democracy promotion. And so I think there's a story there that has to be straightened out. I do think I would agree with John that the future of world politics and of American grand strategy in the world is towards East Asia. And I think we need all the liberal democracies running on all their cylinders at full speed if we are going to make a go of it.
Well, our midshipmen are going to be busy when they graduate, that's for sure. Well, unfortunately, class starts at 1:30, so the midshipmen have to run. So we can close at that. And I want to thank Drs. Ikenberry and Mearsheimer for really just clearly laying out pretty much all the descriptive arguments that pertain to the original three questions, which is the mission of universities to lay out both sides. So thank you for doing that so clearly. And I hope we can host you properly when normal life returns at some point in the next year or two. So thank you both. And to everyone else, have a great rest of the day. And I will send out an email. We have another lecture next week, Francis Fukuyama and Bill Galston on the future of liberal democracies. So thank you all.